They abandoned my 6-year-old because I wouldn't lend $30K. Guess who pays now? The words echoed in the cavern of my skull. Not a thought, but a scream ripping through the quiet Denver afternoon. My son, Leo, was humming softly at the kitchen table, crayon clutched in his small hand, lost in a world of vibrant color on cheap paper. He was 6 years old. And the people who shared his blood, the only remaining connection to the father he'd lost too soon, had just surgically removed him from their lives. Not with a note, not with an argument, but with the chilling, absolute silence of absence. The phone calls stopped. The texts went unanswered. The casual Sunday dinner invitations evaporated. The offer to pick him up from school on the days I had late meetings gone. All of it. Severed as cleanly as a guillotine blade falling. The reason my refusal, my absolute, unequivocal no to lending my sister-in-law, Jillian Reed, $30,000 at $30,000. It was a number that felt obscene, dangling between my precarious financial security and her insatiable, entitled greed. Jillian, the queen of extravagant taste with a pauper's budget, had concocted some hair-brained scheme involving essential oils and motivational retreats, or some such nonsense. And apparently, her startup capital needed a significant interest-free infusion. And who better to tap than Claire, the widow who, they assumed, must be sitting on a pile of life insurance money. What they failed to grasp, or perhaps willfully ignored, was that the modest payout from Mark's policy was the bedrock of our future. It was Leo's college fund, our emergency cushion, the only thing standing between us and the precipice in a world where I was the sole provider, navigating the shark-infested waters of the finance industry while raising a child alone. That money wasn't a luxury. It was our lifeline. So, when Jillian, radiating her usual blend of performative charm and thinly veiled entitlement, had cornered me at a family gathering a few weeks prior, her request for just a little help, family to family, had been met with a polite but firm refusal. I explained, as gently as I could, that lending such a large sum wasn't feasible for me, that my financial obligations were solely focused on securing Leo's future. Jillian's smile had curdled instantly. Her eyes, usually alight with calculated friendliness, turned cold, hard chips of ice. The air crackled with unspoken resentment. The real damage, however, came not from Jillian, but from her parents. Carol and Greg, Mark's parents, Leo's grandparents. They had always been conditional. Their affection for me had been tied to my role as Mark's wife, the vessel for their grandchild. After Mark died, their support had felt less like genuine care and more like an obligation, peppered with subtle judgments about my parenting, my work hours, my inability to replicate their traditional family dynamic. But I had tolerated it, bitten my tongue, plastered on a smile for Leo's sake. He adored his grandparents, his Uncle Tom, his Aunt Jillian. He saw them as his link to the father he barely remembered, stories and faded photographs his only connection. Their reaction to my refusal was swift and brutal. It wasn't just disappointment, it was outrage. How dare I prioritize my own family's security over their daughter's speculative venture? How dare I hoard Mark's money when family needed help? The texts, when they came, weren't requests but demands, laced with accusations of selfishness, disloyalty, and avarice. Family helps family. Claire, Carol texted, her passive aggression a finely honed weapon. Mark would be so disappointed in you. Greg was blunter. Jillian needs this. You have the means. Don't turn your back on us. When I didn't buckle under their pressure, when I reiterated that the money was designated for Leo's future and not available for a high-risk loan, the switch flipped. The communication stopped. Dead silence. It wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy. They knew Leo was my weak spot. They knew cutting him off from his remaining paternal family would be the deepest wound. They thought they could use his innocent heart as leverage, forcing me to choose between his emotional well-being and our financial stability. They believed they could starve me into submission, make my life so difficult that I would eventually crawl back, begging for their help, offering the $30,000 as a ransom for re-entry into their good graces, for the return of Leo's grandparents. Sitting there, the silence of the house amplifying the roaring in my ears, the full, horrifying weight of their cruelty crashed down on me. They hadn't just cut me off, they had abandoned my 6-year-old son, abandoned him because I wouldn't bankroll their other child's folly. The sheer, breathtaking lack of empathy, the transactional nature of their love, the willingness to inflict pain on a child to punish the mother. So, it was a betrayal so profound, it went beyond anger. It was a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just about $30,000 anymore. This was about proving them wrong, proving that I didn't need their conditional support, proving that Leo and I were strong enough on our own, proving that their cruel gamble would not pay off. A white-hot fury, unlike anything I had ever felt, began to spread through me, burning away the hurt, the fear, the despair. They wanted to teach me a lesson. Fine, I would teach them one. They thought they held all the cards. They were about to learn that a single mother in finance, pushed to the absolute limit, could be the most formidable opponent they had ever faced. They wanted to know who pays now. Oh, they were about to find out. Every tear Leo might shed, every lonely holiday, every question he might ask about why Grandma and Grandpa don't call anymore, they would pay for every single one, and I would be the one collecting the debt. My life had fractured 6 years ago, the day the police car pulled into our quiet suburban street. Mark was gone, just like that. One moment, we were planning Leo's 3rd birthday party. The next, I was a 28-year-old widow, holding a toddler, staring into a void. The first few years were a blur of grief, exhaustion, and sheer bone-deep fear. I was a single mother, navigating the crushing weight of sorrow while trying to keep our heads above water. My career in finance became more than just a job. It was the lifeboat. I'd started as an analyst, fresh out of college, armed with a sharp mind and an even sharper work ethic. Mark had been my rock, encouraging me to climb the ladder. After he died, that motivation became a desperate necessity. I worked punishing hours, studying for certifications, taking on extra projects, clawing my way up. By 34, I was a portfolio manager, handling significant assets for clients who demanded precision, discipline, and results. I had built a life for Leo and me, brick by painstaking brick, on the foundation of my late husband's modest life insurance payout and my own relentless effort. Every dollar was accounted for, every investment carefully considered. Our security wasn't handed to us, it was earned, fought for, protected fiercely. This context is crucial to understanding the sheer audacity of Jillian's request and the depravity of her parents' reaction. Jillian Reed, my sister-in-law, Mark's younger sister, had always floated through life on a cloud of easy expectations and inherited privilege. While I was balancing spreadsheets and bedtime stories, she was chasing fleeting trends and extravagant lifestyles she couldn't afford. She had a string of failed ventures, a boutique that went belly up, a catering business that never got off the ground, a wellness blog that generated more debt than income. Each time, there were whispers, veiled hints, and occasionally outright pleas to Carol and Greg for help. And bless their enabling hearts, they usually caved. Jillian was the artistic one, the sensitive soul who just needed a little boost to find her footing. I, the pragmatic, financially stable one who actually worked for a living, was apparently a limitless well of resources waiting to be tapped for her latest whim. The dynamic with Carol and Greg had always been complex. They were traditionalists, outwardly respectable, obsessed with appearances and what the neighbors thought. They doted on Mark, their golden boy, and initially seemed pleased with me, his successful, seemingly compliant wife. But after Mark's death, the dynamic shifted. Their grief was undeniable, but it often felt like it overshadowed mine, or perhaps they resented that I was left behind while their son was gone. They saw Leo as Mark's legacy, a connection to their son, and for that, I was grateful. But they also seemed to see me as an extension of Mark's estate, a caretaker of their grandchild and his resources. There was a constant, low hum of judgment underlying their interactions. My demanding job meant I wasn't the stay-at-home mom Carol had been. My decision to keep Mark's last name but maintain my professional independence seemed to rankle Greg. My budgeting and careful spending were framed not as responsible, but as hoarding or being tight-fisted, especially compared to Jillian's free-spending ways. The tensions weren't always overt. Sometimes it was a sigh when I explained I couldn't make a Tuesday lunch because of work. Sometimes it was a pointed question about why Leo wasn't in a specific, expensive private school they preferred, even though his current school was excellent. Sometimes it was a thinly veiled comment about how lucky I was to have Mark's foresight providing for me, completely ignoring the 12-hour days I put in. I felt like I was constantly being measured against some invisible standard, and consistently found wanting. Uncle Tom, Greg's brother, and his wife Susan were slightly better, less overtly critical. But they went along with Carol and Greg's lead, careful not to rock the boat. The whole family unit revolved around Carol and Greg's expectations, and anyone who deviated was subtly, or not so subtly, brought back in line. The build-up to the $30K request now seemed inevitable in hindsight. There had been smaller loans requested over the years by Jillian, which I'd always politely declined, citing my budget, and more frequent hints from Carol about helping family. The family seemed to operate under the assumption that my financial stability was a communal asset, particularly for Jillian, who seemed incapable of achieving it herself. The assumption was galling. My financial stability was Leo's security, built on my sweat and Mark's legacy, not a slush fund for Jillian's speculative ventures. When Jillian finally cornered me at that ill-fated family barbecue, she started with the usual flattery, praising my career, my success. Then came the pivot. Her voice dropped, becoming hushed and urgent. She painted a vivid, if improbable, picture of her new business venture, talking about ground floor opportunities and massive passive income streams. She needed a small bridge loan, just until her first major payout. The number she threw out, $30,000, hit me like a physical blow. My mind instantly calculated what that money represented for me, 2 years of Leo's potential private middle school tuition, a significant chunk towards a down payment on a slightly larger house if needed, a critical buffer against unexpected illness or job loss. My refusal was calm, measured. I explained, again, about my obligations, about Leo's future being my priority. I remember her face falling, the mask of friendly pleading cracking to reveal a flicker of something cold and calculating. She tried pressing, offering a vague promise of paying back with interest rate unspecified. Of course, but I held firm. Lending family money, especially large sums without a clear professional agreement, was a recipe for disaster, a principle I held firm in both my personal and professional life. More importantly, I wasn't going to gamble Leo's future on Jillian's latest pipe dream. The aftermath of that conversation wasn't immediate. There was a brief, awkward silence at the barbecue. Jillian avoided me for the rest of the day. The true escalation began a few days later, with Carol's passive-aggressive texts, Greg's demanding calls. They didn't frame it as Jillian's need. They framed it as the family's expectation, my duty as a member of the family. They painted my refusal as a personal insult, a betrayal of the family bond. Their words were laced with entitlement and a chilling lack of understanding of my reality. They seemed to believe that Mark's death had somehow indebted me to them, not the other way around in terms of their support for Leo. When I didn't yield, when I reiterated my stance, that's when the silence fell. Complete, absolute, terrifying silence. They didn't just express disappointment or anger, they revoked our membership. They used Leo as the ultimate weapon, banking on the fact that I couldn't bear to see him hurt, that I would sacrifice anything to maintain his connection to his father's side. They underestimated me. They saw a widow, a mother. They missed the financial strategist, the woman who built her life from dust, the one who knew the true value of every dollar, and the even greater value of self-respect and fighting for what is right. The tension wasn't just rising, it had snapped, and the fallout was about to be devastating. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the small apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary. After Greg blocked my number and Carol's calls went to voicemail, the initial shock gave way to a gnawing anxiety. I kept checking my phone, a pathetic, involuntary reflex, hoping for a text, an email, anything that wasn't this deafening void, but there was nothing. The calls I made to Jillian and even Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan went unanswered, or were met with polite, strained brush-offs. "Oh, Claire, things are just so busy right now," Susan had mumbled before hanging up quickly. Busy being complicit, I supposed. The true pain, the agonizing, soul-deep kind, began when Leo started to notice. "Mommy, why isn't Grandma calling?" he asked one evening. His brow furrowed in a way that mirrored Mark's when he was concentrating. "And we haven't seen Auntie Jillian or Grandpa Greg for a long time." My stomach clenched. Stomach. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that the people who are supposed to love him unconditionally have withdrawn their affection because his mother wouldn't write a check? I stumbled through vague answers about people being busy, about needing space, hating the lie but unable to voice the monstrous truth. Each question was a fresh stab, a stark reminder of their cruelty, amplified by his innocent hurt. I watched him look at photos of him and Mark with Carol and Greg, a wistful look in his eyes, and my heart ached with a ferocity that threatened to break me. They were using him, using his love, his need for family, as a weapon against me. But the silence, while devastating, wasn't the only tactic. The escalation took a more insidious turn. The rumors started trickling back to me, whispered from the periphery of Mark's extended family. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, a former colleague of Mark's whose wife was friends with someone who knew Jillian. The narrative being spun by Carol and Greg was a masterpiece of distortion. I wasn't just someone who couldn't lend money. I was being painted as a cold, unfeeling miser, someone who had turned her back on family in need, despite being well provided for by Mark's foresight. They framed my refusal not as a responsible financial decision, but as an act of betrayal, a sign that I never truly cared about Mark's family, only about myself and his money. They highlighted my demanding job, portraying it not as necessary work to support my family, but as proof of my avarice, leaving poor Leo neglected while I chased wealth. "She's changed since Mark died." One report came back. So hard, so focused on money. Another, "Doesn't seem to value family the way Mark did." The implication was clear. I wasn't just being punished. I was being socially excommunicated. My character assassinated to justify their abandonment of Leo. The confirmation of this public shunning came swiftly. That family picnic Carol had mentioned, the one Leo had been so excited about, we weren't invited, not explicitly uninvited, which would have required acknowledging our existence, but simply ignored. The date passed without a word. No call, no text. Later. I saw photos surface on social media photos I only saw because a sympathetic cousin shared them, not because any of the main family members were still connected to me. Smiling faces, picnic blankets, Leo's cousins running around, his grandparents laughing. A perfect picture of family togetherness, with a gaping, deliberate hole where Leo and I should have been. Seeing those images was a physical blow, a visceral representation of our new reality. We were outside the circle, looking in. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control, about punishing my independence, about forcing me back into a mold I refused to fit. The isolation deepened. Friends from my pre-Mark life were supportive, but they couldn't fill the void of his family. The few acquaintances I had made through Mark's side grew distant, uncomfortable caught between the dueling narratives. My days became a relentless cycle of work, childcare, and the heavy silence of evenings without the possibility of a casual call from Carol checking in on Leo, without the occasional, albeit strained, family dinner. The sheer unfairness of it all was a constant ache. Leo, who had done nothing but exist, was paying the price for my financial prudence and their petty vindictiveness. He missed his cousins. He missed the stories Greg used to tell about Mark as a boy. He missed the feeling of being part of a larger family unit, and watching him miss it, knowing why, was almost unbearable. There were days I felt the edges of despair creeping in, the loneliness threatening to swallow me whole. It would be so easy, a voice whispered in my darkest moments, to just give them the money, to end the silence, to bring Leo back into the fold, to stop the pain. But then I would look at Leo's trusting face, remember why I had refused in the first place, to protect his future, to teach him the value of responsible choices, to not reward Jillian's irresponsible behavior or his grandparents' conditional love, and the anger would flare, sharp and clean, cutting through the despair. This wasn't just a personal dispute anymore. This was a war, fought on the battlefield of family loyalty and financial leverage. They were using emotional blackmail and social manipulation. They thought they could grind me down. They thought the burden of single parenthood and their isolation tactics would make me desperate enough to cave. What they didn't understand was that the finance world had trained me for this. It had taught me to analyze risk, to identify weaknesses, to build strategies, and to execute them with ruthless efficiency when necessary. It had taught me that emotion was a liability, but righteous indignation could be a powerful fuel. They wanted to play dirty fine. I knew how to hit them where it hurt. They had weaponized family and abandoned a child over money. I would use the very thing they craved and the very structures they respected, finance, legal leverage, public perception, to make them regret the day they decided to make an enemy of Claire Daniels. The isolation wasn't breaking me, it was forging me into something harder, something colder, something utterly focused on one goal, making them pay. The weight of the silence and the sting of social exile pressed down, but they didn't break me. Instead, they sharpened my focus. I channeled the hurt, the anger, the crushing injustice I felt for Leo, into a cold, calculating resolve. My background in finance wasn't just about managing money, it was about understanding systems, leverage, and vulnerabilities. Their vulnerability was their carefully constructed facade of respectability, their obsession with appearances, and ironically, their deep-seated fear of financial instability. Despite Greg's comfortable retirement, they had tried to use Leo's emotional needs against me. I would use their own values and fears against them. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic event, but a quiet, internal shift. It happened late one night, after Leo was asleep, curled up with his favorite stuffed animal, still occasionally asking why Grandpa didn't call. I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and legal documents, paperwork related to Mark's estate that I had meticulously organized years ago. My eyes fell on a file labeled Read Family Financials Mark's Estate Context, and it contained details I'd needed during probate, information about Greg and Carol's assets, property values, even some details about Jillian's previous financial misadventures that had come up tangentially. Mark had always been open about his family's situation, perhaps as a quiet counterpoint to Jillian's financial chaos. Looking at those numbers, a thought solidified. They had accused me of hoarding Mark's money, of being selfish with his resources. They had used family as a cudgel while abandoning their own flesh and blood. But what did family truly mean to them? It meant control. It meant maintaining their image. It meant ensuring their daughter's comfort, even at the expense of their grandson. Their actions weren't about Mark, or even really about Jillian's genuine need. They were about power and entitlement. And power, in their world, was inextricably linked to money and reputation. I started researching. Not just legal precedents, though I looked into grandparent visitation rights, complicated and often difficult to enforce in cases like this, and I didn't want to force them to see Leo, only make them regret not seeing him, but their financial standing, public records, property deeds, my skills in due diligence, honed over years in the finance industry, proved invaluable. I uncovered details about Greg's pension, their various investment properties, Carol's volunteer work on the board of a local charity that prided itself on family values and community support. I also delved deeper into Jillian's financial history, finding records of small claims, court judgments, and bounced checks, not desperate poverty, but a pattern of irresponsible spending and failing to meet obligations. This wasn't a family facing ruin. This was a family whose sense of entitlement was being challenged. The more I researched, the clearer their strategy became. They wanted to isolate me, make my life unbearable, hoping I'd fold and hand over the money as the price of peace and Leo's relationship with them. They were banking on my emotional vulnerability as a single mother, but they had miscalculated. They had mistaken my pain for weakness. The turning point was realizing that my greatest strength wasn't just my financial acumen, but my complete lack of emotional dependency on them anymore. Their betrayal had severed the cords. I no longer craved their approval or feared their judgment. All that mattered was Leo's well-being and ensuring that such blatant cruelty did not go unanswered. I began building my case. Not for a courtroom battle over money, that wasn't the goal, but for a strategic strike. My goal wasn't just to get the $30,000 back, which I hadn't lent in the first place, but to make them feel the consequences of their actions, where it hurt them most, their reputation and their sense of financial security. I wasn't just going to demand they apologize or see Leo. I was going to demonstrate, irrefutably, that their cruelty had a tangible cost. I drafted a detailed, dispassionate document. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was a financial and ethical indictment. I laid out the timeline Jillian's request, my refusal with stated reasons protecting Leo's future, their subsequent silence and abandonment of Leo, the spreading of false rumors about my character and finances. I included documented instances where they had offered help with Leo in the past, highlighting the abrupt cessation. I attached copies of public records regarding their financial health, showing they were far from indigent and capable of helping Jillian themselves if they chose, without needing to jeopardize my son's security. I included evidence of Jillian's documented financial irresponsibility. The document concluded not with a demand for money or a tearful plea for reconciliation, but with a clear statement their actions had caused significant emotional distress to Leo and myself, damaged my reputation, and demonstrated a pattern of conditional, manipulative behavior. It stated that while I had no desire for ongoing contact based on their current behavior, their public actions particularly, Carol's involvement with a charity focused on family and private conduct were now in stark conflict. It hinted, subtly but clearly, that this information could be shared with relevant parties if their pattern of behavior continued. This document wasn't intended to be sent to them directly. Not yet. It was the blueprint, the distillation of my strategy. It represented my emotional transformation, from hurt and fear to cold, focused determination. I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I wasn't the compliant daughter-in-law biting her tongue. I was Claire Daniels, the finance professional, analyzing a critical situation, identifying the weaknesses, and formulating a plan to protect her most valuable asset, her son, and their future. The turning point was accepting that the family I had tried so hard to belong to didn't exist in the way I had imagined. It was a transactional unit, and they had shown their hand. Now, it was my turn to play mine. They wanted to know who pays. They were about to get the bill. The carefully constructed document sat on my desk, a physical manifestation of months of pain, research, and cold fury. It wasn't just paper. It was a weapon, forged in the fires of betrayal. My target, their reputation, their Achilles heel. They thrived on outward appearances, on being the pillars of the community, the respectable family unit, Carol's involvement with local charities, Greg's prominent position in their retired social circles. It was their shield and their pride. And I was about to show them their shield was brittle. I decided against a direct, emotional confrontation. My strength lay in my professionalism, my detachment. This wasn't a tearful plea. It was a business transaction of consequences. I consulted a lawyer, not for litigation yet, but for advice on how to deliver information in a way that commanded respect and signaled serious intent. On his advice, I drafted a concise, formal letter referencing the core points of my detailed analysis, the request for $30,000, my refusal with stated reasons, the subsequent abandonment of Leo, the spreading of defamatory rumors, and the documented financial stability that contradicted their narrative of desperate need. I included a note about the conflict between their public image and their private conduct, particularly concerning Carol's charity work focused on family values. The letter didn't demand money or even access to Leo. It simply stated the facts, presented the inconsistencies, and concluded with the implication that their actions had created a situation with potential ramifications they might not have anticipated. I included a copy of my summary document as an appendix, page after page of cold, hard data, public records, and timelines. I sent the package via certified mail, requiring a signature addressed directly to Greg and Carol Reed. I knew the mail delivery schedule for their neighborhood from my research. I wanted them to receive it when they were home, together. The waiting was the hardest part, a coil of tension tightening in my gut. The call came 2 days later. It wasn't from Carol or Greg's usual numbers, which were blocked or unanswered. It was from Greg's work line, a number he rarely used, buried deep in my contact list from before he retired. His voice, usually booming and confident, was tight, strained. "Claire," he barked, skipping any pretense of greeting. "What in God's name is this?" I took a deep breath, my voice calm, measured, every bit the finance professional handling a difficult client. "Mr. Reed, it's exactly what it appears to be, a summary of recent events and my perspective." "Your perspective. You sent us this." His voice rose, bordering on a yell. "To our house, certified mail. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that direct communication had failed," I replied evenly. "I was thinking that my son has been deliberately isolated and hurt because I made a responsible financial decision. I was thinking that my character was being publicly maligned. This seemed the most efficient way to ensure you understood the full scope of the situation as I see it, supported by readily available facts." Carol's voice shrieked in the background, muffled but clear. "Facts. She calls this facts, Greg. Tell her she can't do this." "Can't do what, Mr. Reed?" I prompted, keeping my tone neutral. "Can't compile a timeline, can't access public records, can't point out inconsistencies. You think this is a game, Claire? You think you can just threaten us?" Greg's voice was back, laced with a shaky fury. "I'm not making threats," I corrected him, though inside, a steely satisfaction began to spread. "I'm presenting data. You chose to abandon Leo. You chose to spread falsehoods about me. Actions have consequences. This document simply outlines some potential consequences of your actions. Consequences you chose to initiate when you cut us off. Potential consequences. Greg scoffed, but there was a tremor in his voice. Like what? You think you can sue us? That wasn't my immediate plan, I said, deliberately ambiguous. My immediate concern was ensuring you understood that I am fully aware of your financial position, your public activities, and the clear discrepancy between the image you project and the behavior you've exhibited towards your grandson. A pattern of behavior that is now, regrettably, documented outside of our immediate family. I let that sink in. The documented outside of our immediate family part was key. It implied I had shared it, or was ready to share it. There was a tense silence on the other end, punctuated by Carol's distressed murmurs. They were scrambling, their usual confidence shattered. They were realizing I wasn't just a single mother they could emotionally manipulate. I was a sharp, professional woman who understood leverage. I hadn't asked for money. I hadn't begged for access to Leo. I had simply presented the unvarnished truth of their actions, backed by data, and let the potential fallout hang in the air. You think this is going to make us... What grovel? Greg finally sputtered. My objective was to ensure you understood the cost of your decisions, I stated, sticking to my script. You decided the cost of my refusal was Leo's relationship with his family. I wanted to demonstrate that there are other costs, reputational costs, perhaps even scrutiny costs, given certain affiliations. That last part, referencing Carol's charity, landed perfectly. There was a sharp intake of breath on their end. You wouldn't dare. Carol's voice, now clearer, was cold with venom and fear. Wouldn't I countered, my voice still calm, but with an edge of steel. You underestimated me when you thought I'd jeopardize my son's future for a reckless loan. You underestimated me when you thought isolating us would break me. Don't underestimate me again. The question you need to ask yourselves isn't what I'm demanding, but what you're willing to risk. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. You made your choice. You abandoned Leo. Now, you need to decide how you want to handle the consequences of that choice. I didn't wait for their response. I ended the call. The silence that followed wasn't the empty, painful void of their abandonment. It was a charged, strategic silence. The power dynamic had completely shifted. I was no longer the one waiting by the phone, hoping for scraps of affection or acknowledgement. They were the ones reeling, facing the potential exposure of their hypocrisy, the threat to their carefully curated world. They wanted to know who pays now. They had just received the first calculated invoice. The cost wasn't $30,000. It was their peace of mind and their reputation. And the bill had just arrived. The aftermath wasn't a sudden flood of apologies or an immediate reconciliation. Their response was a slow, grudging shift, a palpable sense of panic radiating through the tense silence that followed my phone call with Greg. They didn't call me back immediately, but the pressure was clearly mounting within their own ranks. I imagined the frantic conversations between Greg and Carol, the pointed questions from Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan who, I suspected, had been shown the document, or at least threatened with its contents, the worried glances exchanged when someone in their social circle made a comment about family or grandchildren. Their carefully constructed world of respectability was under threat, not from a scandalous revelation, though I had enough truth to make them deeply uncomfortable, but from the quiet, undeniable exposure of their hypocrisy and cruelty towards a child. Weeks crawled by. Leo occasionally still asked about them, less frequently now, the sharp edge of his initial hurt softening into a dull acceptance that broke my heart in a new way. I continued our routine, focusing on work, on him, on rebuilding our life without the constant undercurrent of their judgment or the ache of their absence. The rumors about me seemed to quiet down, the narrative they had tried to spin losing momentum without a constant stream of new grievances. My document had clearly had a chilling effect. Then, subtly at first, things began to change. An email arrived from Susan, ostensibly about sorting through some of Mark's old belongings, a task we had completed years ago, but I played along. Tucked into the end of the email, almost as an afterthought, was a line, "Leo must be getting so big. We hope he's doing well." No apology. No acknowledgement of the past months of silence. Just a tentative, almost cowardly feeler. I responded politely, keeping it brief and focused solely on Leo's activities, offering no opening for the conversation they were clearly circling. A few days later, a small package arrived for Leo in the mail. It was a book about dinosaurs, something Leo had mentioned liking ages ago. The return address was Greg and Carol's. No card, no note, just the book. No. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to establish contact without having to face the music. A token offering, a minimal effort to mend a chasm they had created. I let Leo keep the book. I didn't acknowledge its arrival to them. Their attempts grew slightly bolder, though still indirect. A carefully worded text from Carol, asking about Leo's school progress. A voicemail from Greg, brief and awkward, stating he hoped Leo was well and that they were thinking of him. Each communication was a tiny chip at the wall of silence, a desperate maneuver to regain some footing, to test the waters of my resolve. They were hoping I would be so eager for Leo to reconnect that I would forget the reason we were disconnected in the first place. They were hoping I would be grateful for these crumbs of attention, but I held firm. I responded to their inquiries about Leo politely, keeping the focus solely on him and his well-being. I did not initiate contact. I did not ask about them, about Jillian, about the $30,000. I did not acknowledge their past behavior or demand an apology. I simply existed, successful, independent, and resolutely unbroken by their attempts to isolate me. I made it clear, through my quiet strength and refusal to engage on their terms, that the price for access to Leo was significantly higher now than mere money. It was genuine remorse, accountability, and a fundamental shift in their behavior. The real breakthrough came unexpectedly. Carol resigned from the board of the local charity. I heard about it through the same grapevine that had relayed the initial rumors about me. The reason cited was personal family matters requiring her full attention. It wasn't a public shaming, but it was a direct consequence. My quiet, documented leverage had clearly made her position uncomfortable, perhaps facing awkward questions or internal scrutiny given her very public role promoting family values. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It showed they understood the potential costs were real, and they were starting to pay. Around the same time, Jillian posted something cryptic on her social media, quickly deleted, about unforeseen setbacks and needing to reevaluate. The Essential Oils motivational retreat scheme had apparently failed, and without my $30,000 bailout, she was facing the consequences of her own poor judgment. There was a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that my refusal had, at least, prevented my money from being thrown into that particular fire. And perhaps, just perhaps, Jillian was starting to feel the pinch that her sense of entitlement had always shielded her from, finally, almost 4 months after the certified letter. Greg called, not from a work line, but from his home number. He didn't launch into demands or accusations. His voice was subdued, weary. "Claire," he said, a long pause. We received your letter, and the document." "Yes, Mr. Reed," I said, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "You did. It laid things out very clearly," he admitted, the words seemingly pulled from him against his will. "That was the intention. Another silence. "Look, Claire," he began, the bluster completely gone. "About Leo. We miss him. Carol misses him terribly." This was it, the moment of reckoning. They weren't talking about Jillian or the money. They were talking about Leo. "Missing him is a consequence of your choices, Mr. Reed," I said, keeping my voice devoid of emotion, refusing to give them an inch they hadn't earned. Abandoning a child because his mother wouldn't finance a speculative venture has consequences. Spreading false and damaging rumors has consequences. This is what those consequences feel like. He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. We made mistakes. We were angry. About the money. About Jillian. "Your anger at my financial decisions should never have involved Leo," I stated plainly. "He is innocent in all of this." "We know," he said quietly. We realize that now. Your letter, it made us see things." He didn't apologize directly. Not in so many words, but the admission hung in the air. "Seeing things clearly is a good start," I said. "We want to see him. Claire," he pleaded softly. "We want Leo back in our lives." This was the debt collection. The price wasn't $30,000. It was their pride. It was their admission, however reluctant, that they had been wrong, cruel, and that their actions had come back to haunt them. They weren't demanding access anymore. They were asking, "Leo misses you too," I admitted, because it was true, and because it was important for him to know his feelings were valid. But relationships aren't transactional. They require trust, respect, and unconditional love. You broke that trust. You showed your love was conditional. We understand," Greg said, his voice thick with something that might have been regret. "We want to make it right, however you think is best." This was the payment, not money, but capitulation. They had abandoned my 6-year-old because I wouldn't lend $30,000. Now, months later, facing the quiet, relentless consequences of their actions and the threat to their reputation, they were the ones paying with their pride, their discomfort, and their grudging acknowledgement of my strength and their wrongdoing. The true cost of their cruelty was just beginning to hit home, and I held the invoice. Guess who pays now? They do. And the terms were now entirely mine. Hanging up the phone after Greg's call, I leaned against the kitchen counter, the silence in the apartment no longer heavy with dread, but humming with a strange, new energy. Victory felt. Quiet. Not a triumphant roar, but a deep, steady thrum of vindication. They had shown their hand, played their cruel game, and lost. The $30,000 had become irrelevant. The true stake was control, respect, and Leo's well-being. And I had won that battle decisively. Their re-entry into our lives was tentative, mediated entirely on my terms. I didn't rush to open the door wide. I established boundaries, starting with supervised visits. Carol and Greg came to my apartment for the first few times, awkward and visibly uncomfortable in the space they had previously treated with condescension. They brought Leo small, thoughtful gifts, not extravagant, but things that showed they had listened, remembered details about his interests. They spoke to me with a new deference, asking permission where before they would have assumed it. Greg, who had once barked demands, now spoke softly to Leo, sharing stories about Mark's childhood with a humility I'd never seen before. Carol, the queen of passive aggression, was almost nervously solicitous, careful with her words, constantly seeking my approval with her eyes. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The chasm they had created couldn't be magically erased. There were still moments of awkwardness, the ghost of their betrayal lingering in the air. Leo, resilient as children are, was happy to see them, but he wasn't oblivious. He was cautious, observing their changed behavior, perhaps instinctively sensing the shift in the power dynamic. He didn't immediately run into their arms as he once might have. He interacted with them tentatively, as if unsure if this new, gentler version was permanent. His cautiousness, heartbreakingly, was another consequence they had created, another part of the price they were paying. They had damaged his trust, and rebuilding it would take time, patience, and consistency, qualities they had previously lacked. I hadn't demanded an apology, but their actions, their careful words, their obvious discomfort were a form of it. The certified letter, the documented facts, the quiet threat to their reputation had achieved what no amount of pleading or emotional argument ever could. They understood now that I wasn't powerless. I wasn't dependent on them. I was capable of defending myself and my son, and doing so effectively. They had learned that the cost of their cruelty wasn't confined to my suffering. It extended to their own comfort, their social standing, and their access to the grandchild they claimed to cherish. Jillian remained largely absent. I heard through the grapevine that her business venture had completely collapsed and she was scrambling to deal with the fallout. Carol and Greg were apparently helping her financially, albeit with much less fanfare, and I suspected a newfound caution born of their own recent discomfort. Jillian never contacted me, never apologized for her role in initiating the conflict or the subsequent silence. She seemed to have faded back into the background, a reminder of the catalyst, but no longer the central antagonist. My refusal hadn't just saved me $30,000, it had insulated me from the inevitable disaster of her scheme. Reflecting on it all, I saw how much I had grown. The grieving widow who bit her tongue and sought peace at any cost was gone. In her place was a woman who understood her worth, her strength, and the importance of setting uncompromising boundaries. I had used my professional skills, not just to manage my own finances, but to navigate a complex personal crisis. I had learned that true power wasn't about having the most money, but about understanding leverage and being fearless in protecting what truly mattered. Justice, in this context, wasn't a dramatic courtroom win or a public shaming. It was subtle, ongoing, and deeply personal. It was seeing Greg's forced humility, watching Carol carefully weigh her words, witnessing their anxious attempts to reconnect with Leo, knowing they were acutely aware that their place in his life was now entirely contingent on my goodwill and their demonstrated change. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing my document sat somewhere in their house, a constant, silent reminder of what they had done and what they stood to lose. The lasting impact on Leo was something I would continue to navigate. He had learned, too young, that family relationships could be fragile, even conditional, but he had also seen his mother stand tall, protect him fiercely, and ultimately command respect from those who had wronged them. I hoped that lesson in strength and integrity would be more enduring than the pain of their temporary abandonment. We didn't magically become one big, happy family. The trust was fragile, the history of hurt undeniable. Future challenges might arise. But for now, the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They were paying for their choices with vigilance, with careful steps, with the constant knowledge that their access to Leo was no longer an entitlement, but a privilege they had to earn back, day by day, on my terms. They abandoned my 6-year-old because I wouldn't lend $30,000. Guess who pays now? They do, not with money, but with the currency that mattered most to them, their pride, their reputation, and the slow, difficult process of rebuilding a bridge they had callously burned, one cautious step at a time, under my watchful eye.